You just finished another losing session. You go back through your hands and, honestly, they look fine. You called with top pair. You called the flush draw. You called because the pot was massive and the price felt right. But your bankroll keeps going down, session after session, and you can't quite figure out why. You're not making obvious blunders. You're not stacking off with garbage. You're just losing, slowly, consistently, in a way that doesn't have a clean explanation anywhere you look. And here's what nobody's actually telling you. The problem isn't what you called, it's why you called. And the real reason is almost never what you think it is. Most players spend years at this game, grinding sessions, studying theory, reviewing hands, and they genuinely get better at most things. They understand ranges better. They play position better. Their sizing improves, and they still hemorrhage money through this one specific pattern without ever identifying it. Here's where it gets painful. It doesn't look like a leak from the inside. From the inside, it looks like careful, responsible poker. That's exactly what makes it so devastating. It's not the big dramatic mistakes that keep most intermediate players stuck. It's the invisible ones, the ones that feel completely correct in the moment, that have a reasonable justification every single time, that never trigger the internal alarm that something went wrong. Calling too much is that leak. By the end of this video, you're going to see your calling patterns in a completely different way. You're going to recognize the specific spots where you've been bleeding chips without knowing it. You're going to understand exactly why those calls keep happening. And you're going to walk away with a concrete system you can apply the very next time you sit down, whether that's tonight, tomorrow, or right now on your phone. If you've ever finished a session genuinely confused about where the money went despite feeling like you played reasonably solid poker, this video is exactly for you. Let's get into it. Understanding this single pattern and breaking it is the difference between a player who grinds forever at the same level and one whose results actually start moving in the right direction. This is the conversation that finally makes the numbers make sense. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every concept here is grounded in real play, real money, and real patterns that show up at every stake level, every format, every time. There's a player type in poker called a call station. And before you roll your eyes and say, "That's not me," hear me out, because most call stations have absolutely no idea they are one. That's not an insult. It's just the honest nature of this particular leak. If it felt like a mistake, you'd have fixed it long ago. A call station isn't the obvious fish who plays every hand and chases every draw to the river with no care for the money. He's not the guy who shoves with air every session. He's actually quite careful. He thinks before he acts. He doesn't make wild bluffs on pure impulse. He folds the clearly bad spots. He's done enough studying to know you can't play junk all day. He just calls a lot. And on the surface, that looks like solid, disciplined poker. Until you check the results over 6 months, over a year, over hundreds of sessions, and the numbers don't match the effort. That's when most players start looking for the problem in the wrong places. They question their bluffing frequency, their pre-flop ranges, their 3-bet spots. They don't look at calling, because calling doesn't feel risky enough to be the source of a major ongoing leak. Here's where most players get destroyed, and they never see it coming. Every time you choose to call instead of raising or folding, you are selecting the one action in poker that gives you the absolute least control over the outcome. You put chips in the middle, and then everything is out of your hands. You wait. You hope. You let the board decide, let the run-out decide, let your opponent's hand decide, and you sit there passively watching what the universe delivers. I understand the appeal of that completely. Calling feels safe. You haven't committed too much. You're being measured. But that feeling of safety, that is the most expensive illusion in this game. Because while you're feeling careful and controlled, you're handing over complete control to your opponent, one call at a time. There are 4 specific ways this pattern costs you money, and I'm going to walk through each one. The last is the worst, and I'd bet it happened in your last session. The hard truth is that most players who describe themselves as solid and conservative are actually just passive, and passive poker is profitable for everyone at the table except you. The longer you stay in that pattern, the more money you leave behind every single session. Recognizing the difference between genuine discipline and expensive passivity is the first step to fixing it. and that recognition starts right now. Let's start with the most fundamental problem, the one sitting underneath everything else. Because once you understand this clearly, everything else clicks. When you call a bet, there is exactly one path to winning that pot. Just one. You have to have the better hand at showdown. That's the entire arrangement. Your opponent bets, you match it. Cards go face up. Yours have to be stronger. One path. Nothing else available. When you bet or raise, you have two completely separate paths. You can have the better hand, or your opponent folds before you ever get there. Two different ways to win the exact same pot, with the exact same cards. This is where it gets expensive, and most players have never actually run the math on what this costs them. Let's make it concrete. You're in a 4-hour session, involved in roughly 40 hands. In about 15 of those, you hit a real decision point where calling, raising, and folding are all genuinely on the table. If you default to call in most of those spots, you are voluntarily giving up fold equity on 15 different opportunities per session. Every single session. Fold equity is real money. It's the profit you collect when you apply pressure and your opponent can't continue. Pots you win without ever showing your hand. Call stations never collect that money, not in one hand, not ever. They've removed that entire profit stream from their game before a card is dealt. Picture this. A player 3 seats to your left has been watching you for 30 minutes. He's noticed you call. He's noticed you never raise when the situation calls for it. In his head, a calculation has already been made, and it's not in your favor. That's the second-order cost, and it might be even more damaging than the first. The math on this is unambiguous, and it compounds relentlessly. Every session you play without collecting fold equity is a session where an entire category of profit simply does not exist for you. And the players at your table who do apply pressure, who do collect that money, they feel the difference between a table where players push back and a table where they do not. You want to be the player who pushes back. Think about it this way. The players who beat you most consistently are almost certainly not doing so because they have better cards. They are doing so because they collect money from every available source, and fold equity is one of the largest and most consistent sources there is. Removing it from your game voluntarily is not being conservative. It is being expensive. Every action you take at a poker table transmits information to every observant player sitting there. When you 3-bet, you send a signal. When you fold the river to a big bet, you send a signal. And when you consistently call without ever raising, call the flop, call the turn, call the river, show up with hands that should have taken a different line somewhere, you are broadcasting a message to the entire table that cannot be unsent. You can be bluffed, and you will not fight back. This is the part nobody tells you about calling too much. It's not just the chips you lose in those hands. It's what those chips purchase in your opponent's minds. Good players identify this pattern within 20 to 30 minutes. Not because they're geniuses, just because they're paying attention. They watch you call 3 streets with holdings most players would have raised or folded earlier. They notice you never squeeze the spots begging to be squeezed. They see you call down in situations where pressure was clearly the higher EV play. And a calculation forms, not always a deliberate one, but a real one. This player is not going to put me in a tough spot. I can fire at him freely. From that point, you're not playing against one opponent. You're playing against a table that has collectively identified you as the most profitable player to attack. Regulars who normally play straightforward start constructing spots specifically against you. Players who would never attempt a multi-street bluff against an aggressive opponent will run it against you without hesitation. Here's where most players get destroyed. Each individual call still feels completely justified in isolation. I had middle pair. The pot was big. I had some outs. All true. But you're not seeing the cumulative effect, which is that you've quietly become the table's designated target, reinforcing that status with every call you make. The longer it continues, the more expensive it gets. The compounding nature of this is what makes it so destructive. It is not just one session where you are the target. It is every session where these players have you categorized. Every hand you play with the same opponents is a hand where that model already exists and is already working against you before a card is dealt. The only way to break that model is to break the pattern that created it. Breaking that model requires only one thing: acting differently, raising in spots you used to call, folding in spots you used to pay off, Each time you do it, the model updates. Each time the model updates, you become slightly more profitable to play with, and much more profitable to be. The ego call. This is the one nobody wants to talk about, because identifying it in yourself requires acknowledging something genuinely uncomfortable about your real motivations at the table. The ego call happens when you call, not because the math supports it, but because you need to be right. You need to catch him. Here's how it plays out. You're in a hand with a meaningful pot. Something about how the villain played it doesn't sit right. His sizing felt slightly off. The line feels too aggressive for a value hand. Something in your gut says, this is a bluff. River hits. He fires a big bet. And something in your brain locks in with real conviction. He's bluffing. You know it. You're not going to let him get away with this. So you call. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes the cards flip and he was bluffing. And that feeling is extraordinary. Validation. Proof that your read was sharp. And that shot of satisfaction makes the next ego call feel even more instinctively correct. Here's where it gets expensive. And this is the part most players never honestly examine. If you ran this exact spot 100 times, same hand, same board, same sizing, same player type, does calling make money? Not this one specific time. 100 times, as a consistent policy. Because the only question that matters is not, was I right once? It's whether the decision has positive expected value over repetition. When you review sessions with genuine, unflinching objectivity, not seeking confirmation you played well, but hunting for spots where emotion drove the decision, you will find that most ego calls are consistent losers. They lose because they're not grounded in math. They're grounded in a feeling in a specific moment, driven by ego, frustration, pride, and the deeply human need to not be the player who got pushed around. The diagnostic test is simple. If your internal monologue contains the phrase, I know he is, I know he's bluffing, I know he can't have it, that is almost never analysis. That is ego talking. And ego at the poker table is extraordinarily expensive at any stake. The fix is not to stop trusting your instincts. Your reads matter. They are real data. The fix is to run those reads through the filter of expected value before acting on them. Feel the read, acknowledge it, and then ask whether the math supports it. If yes, call with confidence. If no, fold with discipline. That distinction, instinct as input versus instinct as decision, is worth a significant amount of money over any real sample. The curiosity call. This is the single most expensive call in poker, and it is disguised so perfectly as something rational that most players never flag it as a problem. They think of it as information gathering. They think of it as studying opponents in real time. They think of it as responsible due diligence on a read. It is none of those things. Here's exactly how it plays out. You're on the river, you missed your draw, or you have a marginal hand that deep down you've already accepted is probably beaten. The math doesn't quite work against a realistic range. You've mentally started moving on. And then, river comes. He bets big. You stare at the screen, or you look down at the felt, and something just won't let you go. You have to know. You have to see it. So you call. Not because you think you're winning, not because there's a sound mathematical argument here, but because you've been in this hand for 4 streets, put chips in at every stage, and you absolutely need that closure. This is the part nobody talks about, because it feels responsible. It feels like learning. But here's the brutal truth. You are paying the full price of that river bet. $50, $100, $200, purely to satisfy a feeling. Not a strategic outcome, a feeling. And the information you receive doesn't meaningfully improve your future decisions. You already had a read. Seeing the cards confirmed or denied doesn't give you usable data. It gives you closure that costs real money every time you buy it. There's a line in one of the Mind of a Grinder books that hit me cold the first time I read it. I had to see it. Is the most expensive phrase per word in poker. You're paying full price for information that changes absolutely nothing about the hand you just played. Let's run the numbers. 3 curiosity calls per session, $60 average. 3 sessions a week. That is over $28,000 a year walking out of your bankroll. Not bad beats, not coolers, pure curiosity. Say that out loud, $28,000. Here is what makes the curiosity call so hard to eliminate. The times you pay and see something genuinely useful feel like they justify the habit. You catch a bluff once, learn a tell, and your brain files it as evidence that curiosity calls are worth it. But that is survivorship bias. For every useful piece of information you paid full price to receive, there are a dozen times you paid full price for nothing actionable. The aggregate of those transactions, run honestly, is overwhelmingly negative. The players who eliminate curiosity calls do not eliminate curiosity. They find cheaper ways to gather the same information through observation, pattern recognition, and hand history, all available without paying river bets to confirm what you already suspected. Now let's go a layer deeper, because there's a structural range problem sitting underneath all of this that most intermediate players never address. And it's the underlying issue that ties every calling leak we've discussed into one coherent, expensive pattern. Most players think about calling in terms of individual hands in isolation. Do I have enough equity with this specific holding in this specific spot? That's a legitimate question, but it's only half the picture. The half most players skip entirely is thinking about your range as a whole. What does my complete range of possible hands want to do here? How many of those hands are clear calls? How many should raise? How many should fold? And critically, am I calling with the right part of my range, or am I calling with hands that belong in a completely different category? Here's where most players get destroyed without realizing it. When you consistently call too wide across your entire range, you create two compounding problems simultaneously. First, you're putting money in with hands that don't have the equity to justify it. Hand by hand, the drain seems manageable. Across hundreds of hands and months of play, it quietly destroys your win rate in ways that never show up dramatically in any single session review. The second problem is subtler and arguably worse. Calling too wide makes your range look weak and capped, which, as we established, directly transforms you into the table's primary target. These two problems don't add together, they multiply. The wider you call, the weaker your range looks. The weaker your range looks, the more confidently opponents attack. The more they attack, the more often you face difficult decisions with hands that weren't strong enough to be there in the first place. Understanding your range holistically, not hand by hand, is the single change in thinking that breaks this cycle and opens up a different level of play. And the fix for it is simpler than you think. The practical shift is this. Before deciding whether to call, raise, or fold with a specific hand, ask one additional question first. Does this hand fit the calling range, the raising range, or the folding range in this spot? Not just whether you can call with it, but whether it should be in your calling range at all. That reframe, from individual hand analysis to range-based thinking, is what produces consistent, structural improvement in your results and makes your play feel deliberate rather than reactive. Now let's talk about the specific spots where this leak shows up most often and costs the most in practice, because abstract principles are useful, but what actually changes behavior is recognizing the exact moment a mistake is forming while you're still in the hand before the chips go in. The first dangerous spot is the small C-bet call on the flop. You've called pre-flop. Villain fires a small continuation bet, a quarter to a third of the pot, and you've got something worth considering. Middle pair, a gut shot, 2 overcards. The price looks reasonable, and it feels like a low-cost call while you gather information. But here's where it gets expensive. What's your plan for the turn? If your honest answer is, I'll see what he does and figure it out then, that is not a plan. That is drifting downstream, hoping something good happens. A real plan means knowing in advance what you do in different turn scenarios, not improvising after you've already put more chips in. The second dangerous spot is the turn barrel call with no river intention. You called the flop. Villain fires again on the turn, bigger this time, and you talk yourself into another call with partial equity and a growing reluctance to give up the pot. You're 2 streets deep now. Real money committed. Hand hasn't improved. River is coming. This is the part nobody tells you about multi-street calls. You're not making one decision. You're making a commitment to a sequence of decisions. And if you don't have a clear plan for how that sequence ends, you're not playing poker, you're reacting. The third and most expensive spot is the river call with essentially no showdown value. Everything missed. Board ran out badly. Your hand beats almost nothing. And he bets large. At this point, sunk cost thinking, ego, and hope combine into one final, expensive call. And that call, the last in a 3-street sequence, is consistently the most damaging hand in a losing session. These three spots have something in common. In each one, the player arrives at the expensive call through a sequence of individually defensible decisions. Each step felt reasonable. Each call had a justification. But the sequence as a whole represents a significant leak because no individual step was interrogated for whether the overall trajectory made sense. This is exactly why the one-question system matters most in these spots, forcing you to think about the entire trajectory of the hand, not just the current street in front of you. If you apply the one-question system to these three spots alone and nothing else in your game changes, your monthly results will reflect it. These are the highest frequency, highest cost calling leaks in most intermediate players, and they are entirely fixable with nothing more than a habit change. Here is the practical system for actually fixing this at the table. Not in theory, not at home reviewing hands, but in real time, under pressure, with money on the line and the clock running. Before every call, one question and three filters, non-negotiable. No exceptions, even for spots that feel obvious. The question, if I call here, how exactly am I winning this pot? Not, could I possibly win? Not, maybe he's bluffing. How, specifically, concretely, am I winning this pot? What chain of events has to happen for this call to be profitable? If you can't answer that with a clear logical explanation, you don't have a call. You have a hope. And hope, repeated across thousands of hands, is one of the most reliable ways to lose money in this game. Then the three filters. In order, every time. Filter 1. Equity check. What is my actual equity against the realistic range this opponent is playing here? Not the range you want him to have. The range that honestly fits everything you know. His pre-flop action, his sizing on each street, his tendencies, his position. Be ruthlessly honest. Players chronically overestimate equity by building opponent ranges that are too wide or too bluff-heavy. Your equity against his real range is the only number that matters. Filter 2. Fold equity check. Is raising a better option here? Is there a version of this spot where applying pressure is more profitable than calling? Here's where most players leave serious money on the table. They never even ask this question. If the answer is yes and you're still about to call, stop. A leak is showing itself to you in real time. Don't walk past it. Filter 3. The why check. The most important of all. Why am I calling? Sit with it. Is the reason mathematical? Pot odds justify it. Equity is there. It's correct on the merits. Or is it curiosity, frustration, ego, the need to catch a bluff, the need to not feel pushed around? If emotion is any part of that answer, any part, fold or raise. Never call from emotion. That rule alone, applied consistently, changes your results faster than almost anything else in this video. Here is the thing about building this habit. The first few times you apply it, it will feel slow. It will feel like you are overthinking simple decisions. But that discomfort is the feeling of a new cognitive pattern forming. Within a few sessions, the question and the filters stop feeling like a process and start feeling like a reflex. And that reflex is what separates players who understand poker from players who win at it consistently. Here's the piece most players miss entirely when they start tightening their calling ranges. And it might be the most valuable insight in this whole video, because it reframes fixing this leak from damage control into something that actively generates new profit. When you stop calling as your default action, you don't just stop the bleeding. You don't just plug one leak and return to neutral. You start generating a completely new stream of profit from a direction that genuinely surprises most players the first time they experience it. Think about how your opponents currently model your play. They've watched you call. They've seen it consistently enough that it's baked into their strategy against you. So they've already made specific adjustments to exploit it. They've pulled back on bluff frequency because you're not reliable to fold, and they've sized up their value bets because they know you'll pay off wider ranges than you should. That equilibrium costs you money every session. This is the part nobody talks about, because it's invisible until you change. Now imagine you start folding spots you used to call. You start raising spots where calling was the automatic response. Over the next hour, your opponents start noticing. The player they had modeled as passive is suddenly unpredictable. Calls that used to feel automatic now carry real weight. When you do call, it means something different, because they've seen you fold the same spot before. Raises that might have been dismissed now command genuine respect. Your table image, not an abstract concept, but a direct mechanical factor affecting how much money flows toward or away from you, starts shifting in your favor. And every disciplined fold compounds. Each one is a deposit into an account that pays returns on every future bet, raise, and call you make. You're not just stopping a leak. You're building an asset. Every fold from discipline is adding to that account, and accounts like that compound in your favor over any significant volume of play. Here is a useful way to think about this transformation. Your current calling pattern is essentially a subsidy for your opponents. Every time you call when you should fold or raise, you are transferring money into their stacks with minimal resistance. When you stop doing that, you stop being a subsidy. When you start raising in those spots, you become a player who needs to be accounted for. And that shift has a direct, measurable, compounding effect on your results every session you sit down to play. Let's pull everything together, because I want to make sure this lands as something you actually use, not just ideas that fade before you next sit down. 3 things. Concrete, specific, implementable starting tonight. First, make the one question a non-negotiable reflex before every single call, forever going forward. Before every call, without exception, how am I winning this pot? Make it automatic. Make it the first cognitive response when a bet comes your way and the instinct to call fires. Drill it in easy spots so that when you're in a big pot under real pressure, the question fires before the chips go in. When you can't answer it cleanly, the default is fold, not call. Calling without a clear answer is a hope call. And hope calls, tracked honestly over a month, add up to a number that would shock most players into changing immediately. Second, start tracking your curiosity calls as a separate category. For 30 days, every time you make a river call, you knew going in was probably a loser. Mark it. At the end of the month, multiply by your average cost. Look at the annual projection. That number, not a concept, not a principle, but an actual dollar figure, will change your behavior permanently. Because concepts live in your head. That number lives in your bankroll. Third, for one full session next week, run the fold equity check deliberately before every call. Every time calling is your instinct, genuinely consider raising before you act. You don't have to raise, you just have to ask. That pause reveals profitable lines your autopilot is completely bypassing. One question, 3 filters, 1 rule. That's the whole system. And here's what changes when you apply it consistently. Your results change, not eventually, not after months of grinding. The very next session, you'll notice it. The pots feel cleaner. The decisions feel sharper. The money you used to leak quietly starts staying in your stack. If this video opens something up in your game, the Mind of a Grinder series goes much deeper into every dimension of this thinking. 10 books, technical foundations through psychological mastery. Link in the pinned comment. And before you close out, drop a comment. What's the call you make most often that you already know, somewhere deep down, is probably wrong? I read every single one. From now on, you don't call to see, you call to win. That is the whole game. Drop that comment. I read them all. From this point forward, you do not call to see, you call to win.
The river is an ace of spades. All in. A massive overbet on the river. And he shows pocket kings.